And we are going to hear from Will Errickson, criminal justice paper, James Madison as a great statesman.
The way we're doing it is to show you
Hello everybody, my name is Will and I want to talk to you today about how James Madison is a great statesman. James Madison was a political genius and a great statesman. He authored the United States Constitution and was the primary leader of its ratification process. The Federalist Papers, which he co-authored with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, is a revolutionary compilation of 85 essays arguing the case in favor of the Constitution. The Federalist Papers were written as a response to the Anti-federalist objections to the Constitution. These objections were tyranny of the majority, the issue of having a republic spread across a large territory, and balancing power and the need for energy, stability, and liberty within the mechanisms of the federal government. Slavery was also a huge hurdle to overcome. For all of these complaints, Madison had a well-thought-out response using reason, logic, and a vast knowledge of political history. And his genius will be explored throughout this analysis. Tyranny of the majority was perhaps the most important concern of the Anti-federalists, because in a democracy, the majority vote rules. Protecting minorities was a major goal for many of the Founding Fathers because they were in the minority. Many of them were rich landowners with leadership positions. They needed to look out for their own self-interests while also protecting the rights of the overall population. In a democracy, factions will naturally form, and the Founding Fathers needed to find a way to prevent majority factions from causing despotism. In response, Madison said the United States should become a large commercial republic. One advantage of a republic is that when good gentlemen candidates are elected, they will ideally look out for the greater good of the people. They also act as filters to prevent bad laws and policies. Commercializing a republic was the primary solution against tyranny of the majority because it introduced more factions. The more factions there are, the harder it is to form a majority faction. In multiplying the factions, this naturally creates more diversity. In order for any of these minority factions to form a majority, they would have to form a coalition and compromise with each other on many of their positions. This would naturally filter out radicalism and produce a coalition that is more moderate or centrist that minorities can get behind. The final benefit of having a large commercial republic is its size itself. Having a republic spread across a large territory makes it much more difficult for coalitions to form at all. The sheer size and diversity of the nation would promote many different types of commerce and increase markets, which would create more factions. Also, with a large territory, there is more distance between representatives and their constituents. This makes representatives less susceptible to the passions of their communities and allows them to make decisions based on reason and logic. Passions of the people can at times be reckless and irresponsible, and many of the Founding Fathers sought to prevent this. The large territory of the Republic, however, was also a complaint of the Anti-federalists because they made the claim that it would be impossible to have a successful democracy spread across a large nation, which was an accurate criticism. In a pure democracy, the citizens would show up to vote on every law, ordinance, and policy, which would be impossible to establish and operate on a large scale and gather all of the citizens of the country in one location to vote. Madison's response, however, was quite simple. He said the states were already too big to operate as pure democracies, so a change needed to be made anyway. He also stated that the Anti-federalists were confusing democracies with republics. Pure democracies do require small territories in order to operate effectively. However, the Constitution was not establishing a pure democracy, it was establishing a democratic republic, where the citizens elect representatives who can go to one central location and perform the legislative tasks. This solves the problem of having a large territory. However, the Anti-federalists claimed this gave the federal government too much power. By placing the government in one central location, the Anti-federalists tried to make the case that this disconnected the representatives from their constituents. This encouraged corruption. They feared the government would become too powerful and begin to form a despotic aristocracy. Madison's response to this argument was perhaps one of his most ingenious persuasions yet. Madison understood the concerns of the Anti-federalists, yet he also understood the need for a strong federal government. Under the Articles of Confederation, the United States had a very weak government. The government consisted of only the legislative branch. Madison's solution was a masterful balance of three essential characteristics of any successful government. These characteristics were energy, stability, and liberty. And they were balanced within the separation of powers between the three branches of government. Energy is primarily found within the executive branch. A strong executive has the power to enforce the laws that the legislative branch passes. Without an executive, there was no way under the Articles of Confederation to enforce laws. So it lacked energy. The goal of stability, as Madison explained, is to ensure peaceful transitions between elected officials and to ensure the stability of the government itself. This is found within the Senate of the legislative branch, the judicial branch, as well as the Constitution itself. The Senate provides stability because its office holders are elected to lengthy 6-year terms. The entire Senate is not eligible for election every 6 years. Instead, their elections are staggered to 1/3 of the Senate being elected every 2 years. This ensures a peaceful transition between elected officials and prevents the Senate from being overrun with representatives who have little or no legislative experience. Also, before the 17th Amendment, senators were not directly elected. State governments elected their representatives of the state to represent the state's affairs. This means that they were not subject to the passions and whims of the people. Stability is also found in the judicial branch with the Supreme Court. Members of the court are appointed to lifetime terms. This provides a tremendous amount of stability and predictability within the judicial system. The Constitution also provides a great amount of stability because it is difficult to amend. A stable Constitution fosters a stable government. In these ways, James Madison exhibited a deep understanding of the importance of stability in government. The third and final characteristic of government that Madison masterfully explained was liberty, which is found in the House of Representatives, the Bill of Rights, and in the state governments themselves. Members of the House of Representatives are elected to short 2-year terms, and the people directly elect them. Therefore, representatives are more responsive to the passions of the people. This creates a natural tension between liberty in the House and stability in the Senate. However, there is a near perfect balance between the two. The House uses the passions of the people to provide a check on the Senate and make sure they do not form an aristocratic despotism. Likewise, the stability of the Senate and their use of reason prevent sometimes unreasoned passions of the House from having too much influence in the decisions of government. Many people complain about the dysfunction in our Congress. However, a careful analysis of the true purpose of each House of Congress and its implementation of stability and liberty actually calls for this dysfunction. It is actually a filtration process with the purpose of coming up with the best legislation possible that can be agreeable to both sides. Liberty was also found in the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights ensures 10 basic individual rights to the citizens of the United States that shall not be infringed upon by the government. Now, Madison's last argument for liberty was our system of federalism, which shares power with the state governments and helps to ensure liberty for the states to govern as they see fit. However, with all the effort that was put into maintaining liberty in the young nation, there was one group of people who experienced quite the opposite of liberty. My fourth and final argument, proving James Madison was a great statesman, was the tactful way in which he dealt with the dividing issue of slavery. Now, James Madison personally was appalled by slavery. Unfortunately, by the time the Constitutional Convention was taking place in Philadelphia in 1787, slavery was deeply embedded in Southern American culture. Madison knew there would have to be some compromise on slavery. 9 of the 13 states were needed to ratify the Constitution, and roughly half of these states were slave states. The brilliant political strategy that ensued ultimately saved the Union and set slavery well on its way to being abolished. Madison chose to use the issue of representation and taxation in his strategy to fight slavery. Since representation is based on population and taxation is based on property, Madison stated in the Federalist 54 that slaves should be considered property. Madison was using the South's claim to property against them. His goal was to make slavery economically disadvantageous. By considering all slaves to be property and not persons, the South would have extremely high taxes and low representation in the government. According to Madison, the South's argument was that slaves should be considered a mixture of both property and people. They wanted the advantages of counting slaves as people in order to have greater numbers and representation, but they did not want to lose their slaves, so the South still considered them property. The resulting outcome between the two sides was the 3/5 compromise. 3 out of every 5 slaves would count for taxation and representation purposes. This made both sides happier because it gave the South more representation while keeping their slaves. For Madison and those in the North who were against slavery, it increased the South's taxes and made slavery economically more difficult to maintain. It also prevented the South from gaining a legislative advantage in the House. Madison realized that abolishing slavery would have to be done gradually over time because the South was dependent on slavery. Madison also realized the need for compromise in politics. He knew that throughout political history, agreements were only made through compromise. And this is a lesson that today's politicians probably should learn. Madison knew that without the South's support for the Constitution, it would not be ratified and the Union would have failed. Without the Three-Fifths Compromise and the unification of the states under the Constitution, slavery might have continued even longer than it did. In the fight against slavery, Madison proved himself as a brilliant political tactician and statesman. In making the case for James Madison being a great statesman, I acknowledge that I have only scratched the surface of his political genius. My goal was simply to analyze a few of his major political arguments and accomplishments that I found to be most significant. In closing, James Madison truly was a political genius. Was absolutely a great statesman. Without James Madison, who knows what this country would look like today? We might still be a loose alliance of sovereign states under a weak Articles of Confederation. The fact of the matter is that the United States as it is today under a strong and stable Constitution is far better than a loose alliance of weak states. Wouldn't you agree?